Hello, everybody, and welcome to our third part for our three-part webinar series. This is the third and final part with me and Richard Owen over here from Owen CX and from one of the co-inventors of NPS. I'm excited today, so we're going to talk about predictive analytics, and Richard is going to share some of his thoughts around what he has seen and what kind of he envisions, not only what he has seen, but also what he envisions looking into the future and into the future of NPS, into the future of loyalty, into the future of how we measure it, how we predict it, how we analyze it. So this is definitely an important part of our series around customer experience. There's no point collecting all the data if we cannot really kind of utilize it in the boardroom, utilize it for financial outcomes. So I'm super excited as usual to welcome Richard back to the show. Richard, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks, Vivek. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. Quick introductions. I'll give a brief introduction about myself. I'm one of the founders here at QuestionPro. We are a technology platform for customer experience, employee engagement, as well as market research, kind of under the context of surveys. We obviously started off in the survey business and then outgrown it, and we have three different verticals right now that we focus on, and customer experience is clearly one of our hottest and growing verticals that we focus on from a technology perspective. And Richard over here, and I want Richard to kind of give him, a brief introduction of himself. But I've known him for almost 5+ years now. Back when he was running Satmetrics, that's when I got introduced to him, and he's a dear friend of mine, a mentor, an advisor, a friend, and everything in between. So thank you, Richard, for coming on to the show. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're most welcome.
Awesome. So we'll jump right into it. The agenda for today is, looking into kind of predictive analytics around, obviously with CX, we collect a lot of data, but how do we kind of really look at it from different angles and really kind of, correlate that to financial outcomes. That's kind of our biggest driver for even running an CX program, frankly. And Richard will talk a little bit about the current state of affairs. He's right here in Silicon Valley, along with me. We see a lot of kind of AI-driven companies, predictive modeling that he's worked on. And then towards the latter part of the presentation, we'll go through some of the models that we've implemented here at QuestionPro, baked into the platform, and I'll walk you guys into 2 or 3 models around driver analysis and modeling around that. And then we'll call it a day after that. So it should take about 30 minutes to 40 minutes. So that's kind of what we are planning on. With that, I'm gonna hand this over to Richard. Richard, can you just go for it? Go for it, Richard.
All right, thanks for that, Vivek. And predictive analytics, it sort of fits in a lot of these popular buzzwords that we see absolutely every day here, especially coming out of Silicon Valley. It's a sort of hot topic. In fact, there are so many buzzwords. In fact, you could argue that we're actually trying to create an IBM commercial. But I think you can actually focus on the real benefit of prediction when you start to think about how analytics evolve. There are 2 big opportunities that we see for using predictive analytics in CX programs. The first one really is, how do you improve on data quality? And data quality is a really big topic that people in the CX industry, I think, often overlook. When you talk to senior executives and you say, what is the #1 issue that prevents you from investing and getting behind CX initiatives, they will tell you that they believe the data quality is insufficient to make a case for major transformational investment. If you think about it, they're used to using financial data, very high quality data, and we provide them with very poor quality data, often based on relatively small sample sets and often based on a really misunderstanding of how, in today's economy, customers are actually performing. So we have an opportunity to improve data quality massively by using prediction to sort of fill in the gaps that are left when surveys can't reach every single individual. And that doesn't mean it's the end of surveying, far from it. It means that surveying presents a foundational role that we can build on to create better data quality. And better data quality will transform not just the usefulness of CX programs, it'll also actually light up a whole bunch of other really useful analytics that today are kind of boring if you don't have really good quality data. The second area of application here is really, how do we draw better insights out of the data? And so, okay, so now you've got a much better data set, but can you use that to actually create a far better set of insights? And this is where machines are better than humans in some regards, and thankfully humans are better than machines in some. And so we're going to sort of draw that contrast out when we look about how we create very compelling ways to present our data to people. So the best chart I've ever seen when it comes to understanding analytics, and I wish I could say I created it, but it's freely available on the internet, is this sort of hierarchy of reporting all the way up through analytics. And you'll see at the far left, you've got raw data, and it migrates all the way up through ad hoc reporting to some fairly generic analytics sets, predictive modeling. And we're really asking the question, what's going to happen? But predictive analytics can be used for more than understanding the future. It can be a mechanism for better understanding the present. And we're going to talk about that distinction as well. The big thing I always take away from this is the term analytics is another popular buzzword and is often simply applied to basic reporting. Reporting isn't really analytics. Reporting is just what it suggests. It's basic data. Analytics presumes that you take that data and you transform it to add value, use algorithms to make changes. If there's no algorithmic transformation, my book, that's not really analytics. So we're most interested in where you go after you've got the raw data. Well, what is the problem we're essentially trying to solve when it comes to using predictive analytics? Well, let's start with the basic framework of what would be a very common structure for how people build CX programs. They do it in waves. And on this chart, we've picked 3 waves seasonally. We've got a winter, we've got a spring, we've got a summer wave. So somebody's doing this survey maybe once every 3 months or so. And in each wave, they get a mix of respondents. And this is sort of typifying a single account, perhaps. And this account has 3 levels of segmentation of respondents. Maybe that's decision makers, influencers, and users. And in each account, you can see that some of these people have responded, promoters green, detractors red, but a lot of people haven't responded. And in the second wave, you get a similar pattern of response, different people responding, different people not responding, and so forth and so on for the third wave. And so what can we say about the quality of this data? Well, we can say there's actually hard to do a great deal with this. First of all, the data is not very current. It's always old, and it's somewhere between 3 months old and 1 day old, so it's an average of a month and a half old. In today's economy, the idea that your data is a month old is pretty funny, right? We're used to data that is right up to the minute. So that's a problem. It's also incredibly incomplete. Lots of people, we don't know what they think. And so these 2 things are really not what we want. What we're looking for is really something which says, okay, we want complete data. We sort of want it all daily. We'd like every single person, every single day. Now that's a much more complete data set. And it's higher quality in 2 important dimensions. Obviously, it's much more timely, which means that you can react to changes much more effectively, and it's much more complete. You're having to do far less heroic extrapolation. So I don't think any of us would disagree that that's an ideal data set and the one before isn't. So the real question is, how are we going to get from here to there? And the good news is that this is mainly a function of prediction. If you think about it, Net Promoter, trying to categorize people as promoters or detractors, is really just a matter of how do we get people into 3 different buckets. We're trying to take every single individual and put them into 3 buckets. And we believe that those 3 buckets perform differently in terms of their economics. So we put them into this detractor bucket, the passive bucket, and the promoter bucket. And we happen to use surveys to do it because it's a really convenient and easy way to do it. And it's how we sort of started all this. But any mechanism we can use to correctly allocate people to one of these 3 buckets is really good. And so the problem comes down to, how do these people who don't respond to surveys or we can't reach with surveys, how do we figure out which of these 3 buckets they're in? Well, you can use journeys. And the challenge with journeys typically is that journeys tend to be very, very complex. So this is an example of a very complex journey chart. And you might say, well, hold on, you're suggesting that we analyze every aspect of the journey as a foundation for prediction. I'm saying, well, that's not necessarily the case. That's That would be bad news if we had to do it because it's a very complicated problem. The good news is it turns out that in almost every single instance, companies' ability to create promoters or detractors is based on doing a relatively small number of things relatively well. Now, I'll repeat that. You could have a journey map that comprises, like the last one, of maybe 50 different items. But the fact is, the factors that actually materially impact the creation of promoters or detractors are usually a relative short list. And so our challenge is figuring out which of the journey factors impact CX, create promoters, create detractors, and calibrating at what point of execution those different variables create promoters versus detractors. So it's a much more tractable problem. If you can imagine that most companies probably need to find 3 to 5 specific things they deliver for each customer segment, calibrate them, then they can use that mechanism to predict customers. And it's about understanding the relative impact. Now, we could go into a lot of details around how exactly this takes place. A lot of it is around being able to identify which of these journey factors create delight, which ones are sort of hygiene factors, or, if you like, Kano curves. That's sort of one way of thinking about them. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is separate the things that make a big difference from those that don't, isolate them, and figure out at which point they make a big difference.
Hey, Richard, I have a quick question over here.
Go ahead.
I think I understand this in terms of kind of understanding the different touch points and which ones are delight factors versus just which ones are kind of minimum required to have. Are you kind of suggesting that kind of the journey map, complex journey map, be reduced to a set of kind of concrete, kind of simplistic touch points, and within those touch points, like maybe 3 to 5 items that really matter? And do you see that being done on a subjective kind of ethnographic level, or do you see that as a kind of more mass market kind of let's talk to everybody and understand the journey? How do you see that actually working
So I think I think the reality is that the work we all do with surveying, where we essentially plot out correlating variables in our surveys, by and large informs us adequately as to which factors matter to customers and the degree to which those factors matter. So I think that surveying is a tremendous calibration technique for figuring out what matters to customer groups. Now, you can subsegment that as much as you want, right? You could say, I'm going to take 10 different customer segments and I'm going to plot them out all differently. Or you could say, I'm just going to take one big pile and throw it all in there. But surveying enables you to identify from the customer's perspective the factors that matter, and it also helps you figure out the degree to which they matter. Mm-hmm. Predictive analytics takes that information and says, based on that, and based on how we know we perform as a business, can we therefore predict whether people are promoters or detractors? So let's make a very, very practical study. Let's imagine that the only thing that matters to your business is whether the product ships on time. Mm-hmm. And so you've done all the research, you've used the surveying techniques, and you've seen this perfect correlation between shipping on time and the creation of promoters. So now you know that you've got a very high degree of confidence that every single customer that receives a shipment on time, there's a statistical likelihood they're a promoter. Now, there's other factors go into that, but there's a high probability of a promoter because you've isolated this one silver bullet. Everyone you miss on shipment is a high probability they're a detractor. So now, if you can measure shipping, you've essentially got a predictive model for promoters or detractors. I was going to say, of course, it's not that simple. You're going to end up with multiple variables, but the underlying principle is the same. Surveys inform how you build models. The model informs how you calculate promoters and detractors.
Got it. And then you use the models to drive change, right? That's the basic analysis. The KPIs becomes those models, those elements that you determined.
Precisely. And ultimately, what you're trying to get to is a much more complete data set, because you're trying to essentially predict whether people are promoters or detractors to fill in the fact that they don't respond every single time to a survey, and they don't respond in real time. So surveys become outstanding calibration engines, but the machine ultimately generates the results. And every time I talk to people about this, the objection I always get from people is, well, it's not truly the voice of the customer. It's not what the customer says. They didn't tell you they were a promoter. You inferred that they were. And I think that's frankly missing the point. I think we want to correctly segment customers. Whether they tell it to us or we predict accurately that they are should be immaterial. There's no pure truth to this.
Right. And the point that you're trying to make is that the data quality around like the shipping on time is much more complete and holistic because that's internal data. So you're not worried. So you can completely determine 97% of the time you ship the product on time and you've missed the boat by 3%. And that data quality is pristine and frankly relatively easier to get than holistic survey data.
Yeah, and I think that in most businesses, the hardest part is figuring out how not just to identify the aspects of the business that are likely to impact customers, but also calibrate them. The calibration is obviously tricky. If we said, what's an on-time shipment? Is that, within 3 hours or 5 hours? Is it, delivery versus shipment? So there's a lot of work goes into specifying exactly the thresholds and the tolerances. And of course, it doesn't just boil down to one silver bullet, but the principle is pretty much the same. And so you can easily see a world in which we get a much more robust data set based on building models around known customer behaviors measured through surveys and extrapolated into how they experience your product or service.
Got it. Makes sense.
So, thinking of it that way, surveys become really teaching systems. They become calibration tools. And that's important over the long run because we know survey response rates are going to be under pressure. And the notion that we're going to be able to get very complete data sets from customers is a challenge. We know that extrapolation, which is core to everything we do in surveying, is getting harder and harder because we want more and more subsegmented response groups. We want to be able to really dig into the data. So it starts to make sense to take calibration techniques out of surveys and apply them to these predictive models. And just to illustrate, the wheels actually move on the predictive model here. So obviously, then that turns around and says you can actually start to specify within your business the thresholds that are targetable. So you identify the KPIs that impact NPS, you figure out how to optimize them to create promoters, and you calibrate the performance to set goals. And operationally, this is a more robust approach than traditionally most companies use to create operational targets. It's a lot easier to go to and say, look, you want to create promoters, ship within 48 hours of an order is a lot easier to set as an operational goal than trying to impact some of the typical variables we see in CX programs, which are a little bit harder to turn into operational goals. So there's some downstream benefits about being able to set very specific operational targets out of this kind of analysis. So operational goals really tie together the whole issue of calibration using surveys and predictive models. So what we see the potential as here, and these wheels go around a little bit, is this opportunity, as I say, to create a real solution to data quality. And I think it's important for us to address this, not just because it's the credibility of CX programs, but ultimately, if we're going to compete with other sources of information within the business, if we're going to be relevant, we're going to have to up our game in terms of data quality, because data quality created by data exhausts in consumer spaces or just created by much more digital transformation that's occurring in all segments of business is generally improving. And we're getting a lot more data on customers from other sources. And if in the CX world, we're sort of harnessed to a data source that's deteriorating and not very high quality, our data is going to seem less important or less useful. So this is one way of solving it. So let's talk a bit more about how, post creating better data sets, how do we actually start to develop and share insights in a better fashion? And this is a slide from the masterclass that we use a lot when we start to talk about how people actually do this. Now, this is quite a busy slide. I mean, these are taught in the class, so they tend to be fairly intense. But the basic idea is pretty straightforward. Every type of presentation is really trying to do three things. We're trying to identify performance. And when it comes to performance, we're trying to identify significance. You know, one of the biggest problems people have when they present is they tend to present a lot of data, a lot of which has no significance. We struggle to zero in on the things that matter. Modest changes don't make any difference. It's entirely possible that you could do an entire results presentation where your message to the management team is nothing's changed. And yes, of course, things move slightly, but if it doesn't move significantly, why is it something that we care about? So performance and really able to identify significance in performance matters. Then you've got root cause. If you understand performance, the natural question is, how do we actually understand root cause? What is it that we're going to do to improve performance? And then logically, you're trying to get to action, which is, how do we prioritize things we can do? And you don't always do the things that, of course, have the highest root cause impact, because there's cost. Cost becomes a variable in action. So sometimes the easiest things to do, the cheapest things to do, have the highest relative impact on the business compared to some of the things that might just be incredibly expensive or difficult to fix. So moving from root cause to action requires you to start to consider the costs. And typically companies have used a number of different techniques to sort of talk through this. They've used storytelling as a technique, and that really explains how, from a customer perspective, performance impacts them. Some businesses use a challenger approach where they sort of imagine competitors tackling the business, and they say, well, what would a competitor do? Well, they'd zero in on our weaknesses over here. We use customer testimony, excuse me, unstructured data a lot. And that's because we as human beings tend to respond a heck of a lot better to anecdotes than we do to data. I mean, I wish it wasn't so, but the reality is we tend to be much more empathetic with personal stories. So customer testimony is a really effective technique. And then we sometimes simply do competitive contrasts, looking at how the performance of our business and the sort of performance up and down a customer journey compares to that of a competitor. So we start to understand how a customer would perceive the choices they may or may not make. So these are all techniques, but human beings have a bit of a challenge when it comes to that. What we'd really like to do is we'd really like to use two techniques to figure this out. One is we'd like to start with a hypothesis and then test it. So that's very appealing to us. So we have a theory that's wrong with our business. Maybe we think that we're losing customers because we don't ship on time. I hate to pick on logistics people for this entire presentation. It's just an example. But let's imagine that that's our hypothesis, and then we go off and we look for data. And this is a very efficient way of building an argument, because it narrows down the complete range of possibilities. So we can say, okay, we're looking for data to support the idea that it's a shipping problem, and maybe we'll find that data, and maybe we won't. And it tends to be a bit of a bias towards us making the case we believe in and torturing the data to say that. But the bigger challenge with that is that we're not looking at all the possible combinations of data and what it could tell us. We're not doing an exploration-driven approach. And that's because for humans, exploration-driven is an incredibly arduous exercise. Looking at how changes in the data occur across very large data sets and scanning them all to see if anything's interesting is just a practical impossibility. Well, good news. Machines are really good at that. So hypothesis-driven is a very human approach. Exploration-driven is a very machine-based approach. So the way we see machine learning working is that all of the data sets get scanned. And if you can imagine that you have data sets that could go back several years, the machine is capable of looking at all possible combinations and trends and applying a series of tests to them. And the tests are designed to basically figure out whether something is worthy of attention. And the test also has prescribed observations based on it. So essentially, we're scanning through the data continuously, and we're identifying interesting changes that we think of as being quite significant. And that gives us a tremendous amount more flexibility when it comes to identifying particularly interesting changes. So I'll conclude, and that's a bit more of a teaser without a lot of substance, but this is an area, I think, of real ongoing research. What I think the potential leads us to is that when it comes to doing results presentation, we'll be far less biased towards the hypotheses we start with, and machines will essentially narrow down and present us with a whole series of potentially interesting hypotheses that we want to test. So the machine may scan the data and say, ultimately, here are 10, 20, or 30 observations, and here's how we've stacked ranked them in terms of our confidence about them. Now, you as a human being do what you do really well, which is dealing with this kind of vague and uncertain amount of information and all these information sources the machine doesn't have, all the context, all the politics, and you blend that into the story, and then essentially you've got almost the perfect combination of man-machine when it comes to results presentations.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much for that section. And two things kind of really kind of at least stood out for me: the exploration-driven model and what you called, I guess, algorithmic transformation. I think in terms of reporting and analytics, I think those two things definitely stood out. And what I want to do is really kind of go over four different kind of things within QuestionPro that effectively touch on what. At least attempt to touch on what Richard is talking about. And these four things are really, the first level is, the executive dashboard. And the executive dashboard is not just kind of like surfacing data that's at the top level, but really kind of algorithmically determining what to surface. And that's kind of that's our first kind of attempt at kind of, not only just showing top level data, but surfacing interesting information based on a massive number of permutations and combinations, and even some rules and operating rules that can be put into play based on the data. Second thing that I want to talk about is what we call driver XA, which is really kind of the earlier part of Richard's conversation around using surveys to determine what really matters and how does NPS really get affected by the different drivers for NPS. I do also want to talk about response rates, and we have come up with a reasonably good model around kind of how, at least in the B2B context, how response rates are kind of highly correlated to affinity and loyalty effectively. And finally, about mobile dashboards, clearly like making sure the data is present to line level folks who are on the go. Jumping right into it. This is a screenshot of our kind of journey mapping dashboard. As you can see, we have kind of different touch points, but the key part that I want all of us to kind of take a look at is kind of what Richard was talking about is exploration driven, where we are surfacing data. For example, in redeem miles and the lounge, and these bullet points that are being surfaced, where the lounge score was below 40% for both February and March. That's kind of things have been going up and down, but it was below a particular threshold for the last 60 days. And that's when we start surfacing that information up the chain and into a dashboard effectively. So we can definitely present all the NPS scores across the board, but that's too much of data and too much of information, for anybody to really consume and frankly, really action on. However, if the score dips below a particular threshold for more than 60 days continuously, then you have a trend. That's what we call a trend. And if there is a trend, then we want to surface that information. So that's one of the things that we worked really hard on to kind of like saying, look, we just don't want to expose, top line data, but we want to expose kind of the underlying artifacts that make up that data and produce some rules around it. Now these rules will change over time. Should be a 90-day window, should be a 60-day window, or should be a 6-month window. Frankly, that's dependent on the data, the movement, the frequency at which we collect, and the models that we put into play, as well as the algorithmic models that we put into play. So that's an important element that we've kind of focused in on and gotten done. The second one I want to talk about is like, what I talk about is response rates. We've had this kind of, obviously Richard talked about it, response rates are declining, and what can we do with response rates? What we found, frankly, is response rates, are really a function of affinity and what the relationship is. And I'm probably making this case over here more in the B2B context than in the B2C context. In the B2B space, clearly, we all know this, if somebody's not responding to your emails, your level of interaction with them is going down. And fundamentally, we can use response rates as a proxy. In fact, we've worked with 2 or 3 companies right now where we really use response rates as truly as a proxy for determining account health. And if people are not responding to you, that means the account is not healthy. If people are responding to you, then clearly it's the other way around. And what we've kind of invested quite a bit in terms of kind of just disposition metrics for all the surveys, for all the communication, not only the surveys but also regular communications that go out. That data, regular communications, what's your open rate, view rates for regular communication, and that can be plugged into the same model and to say like, look, if response rates are going down month over month, and the response rate is not just for surveys, but even for regular marketing communications and or other communications, then your account is probably going to churn out, because that's kind of the correlation between response rates. And that's why even on the survey side, the response rates and measuring and capturing and identifying them is equally important. In terms of the dashboarding, I mean, we do kind of, a whole bunch of different dashboards, that a whole bunch of kind of like in terms of kind of, diving into the data. But the key thing that I want to speak to towards is what we call the kind of the, what I call the priority matrix. So this effectively is, not only collecting the NPS data, but along with the NPS data, we typically collect a whole set of drivers, a whole set of secondary metrics, where NPS is the primary metric. And then we are collecting, effectively a whole bunch of satisfaction with a whole bunch of secondary metrics. And what we've inferred, and this goes back to kind of Richard's earlier conversation around algorithmic transformation, is that we are not really directly asking people, hey, how important is it for product pricing, design process, timeliness, etc. What we are doing is we are running a regression analysis on it and say like, okay, guys, people who are giving us high NPS scores, what is important to them? How are they scoring the other components? And we do obviously a regression modeling around that. And what that gives us is this kind of gives us a matrix effectively. Obviously you have NPS scores on one, and the R value, which is the correlation between the NPS to any of the other secondary metrics on the y-axis, which is loosely correlated to effectively with importance. So now you have a pretty easy way of saying dividing all the secondary items, and typically the secondary items are all behavior where the company can materially affect everything. So most people come and ask, like, how do you improve NPS scores? Well, you can't just randomly improve NPS scores. What you have to do is to look at behaviors, what you're doing. So can you improve product pricing? Can you improve the design process? Or can you provide 24/7 support instead of 9-to-5 support? Those are things that you can change effectively. But the question really becomes, like Richard said earlier on, comes down to cost. Like, okay, can you provide 24/7 support? Yes, that means staffing your call center with 3 different shifts, because 24/7 support requires 3 different groups of people coming in and out, and it's a massive investment. But the key part that we are trying to get to is the calibration modeling, which is to say which ones of these are important, not based on direct questioning, but based on inferred modeling, which is effectively a regression model that we've used, and that gives you 2 distinct pieces of data. One, things that are obviously of high importance but low score. That's where you need to focus on. It's important enough, but you're getting scores on it. That's driving, that is correlated to NPS, but physically the scores are obviously low on that. That's on the top left corner. As you can see, that's what we call the priority drivers, because these things will really drive the NPS to go up. The flip side to this is what's actually working. The other, is like, okay, you got high NPS scores and they're pretty important. So those are the ones on the top right corner effectively in this model. And we can, determine, and the reason we do the success drivers also is a lot of times companies don't even, don't have a very, very crisp understanding of the models that are actually working to their advantage. So you do more of that, or you kind of acknowledge that. A lot of times there's nothing much to do. You're already doing really, really well in certain areas, and people, deem them to be important. People are really excited about it. And do not understand that really well. And once you understand that really well, you'll, at least intrinsically, the companies can calibrate their KPIs to make sure that the success drivers remain as success drivers, and the priority drivers are the ones that they need to work on. So that's that's what we call our driver XA modeling. And so this gives us a kind of like a caliber, like Richard said, a calibration model to say like, okay, now you can take these KPIs and say like, okay, we're going to take, timeliness of delivery and product availability, and make sure that we remain the leader in product availability, and we start working on, working on, making sure things are shipped on time and confirming that the shipping actually went through on a 2-day shipping cycle. So those are the models, those are the KPIs that can be put based on the data coming out of this kind of modeling. And final thing that I want to talk about is really, we talk a lot about kind of complex models, but realistically what we've seen is making sure the data is available to the right folks at the right place at the right time. And we believe that has made a material and a huge impact in some of the companies we work with, where line level folks have a mobile app where they can get access to their view of the NPS data, their view of the customers. So if you are a store manager, you need to have an app that says like, look, you know what, some guy walked out of my store and he gave us a bad score. And getting that information in real time back to the store manager so that he can intercept, even if he can potentially intercept that customer or call that customer back within 4 hours to address the issue. I think this level of this kind of modeling can be done reasonably easily. Actually, the technology is there. The wherewithal to do the implementation needs to be there, but that in itself has had a huge impact in terms of improving NPS scores. So that's kind of something that I wanted to touch on. And with that, I'm gonna bring it back together. We've kept this thing short. We didn't want to dive too much, can overwhelm everybody. But this is the last of our 3-part series. So again, I want to thank everybody for going us through this journey. Obviously, I want to thank Richard for being part of this and doing the show with us. And for everybody who's gone through this webinar, you can email, as you can see on the screen, you can get a complimentary access to the masterclass that Richard and his team have put together. That'll give you a deep dive into what we've talked about. As you can see, a lot of the content that Richard has pushed out through the webinars is available through the masterclass, and that'll give you a lot of information over there. On our side, on the QuestionPro side, clearly, if you're interested in our technology platform, shoot us an email and an account exec will get back with you. And definitely, we want to give you pilot access to our platform so that you can test it out and kick the tires. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Richard. Richard, do you want to talk a little bit about the masterclass?
Yeah, thank you for that, Vivek. And I'd echo that. Thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this and for everyone who listened in. The masterclass now has three whole courses involved in it. The primary one, which most people are familiar with, the one which about 6,000 plus professionals have now been through, and is the most popular certification of its kind in the world, is the Net Promoter Masterclass, and that's really designed for professionals who run these programs. There is also an executive version of this, which is taught in a half-day workshop, which is usually for the top 10, top 20 in-person members of the C-suite in the company. And we're also very pleased that we're now launching, and people will be able to get access to, a version that's designed for every employee in the organization. One of the things we got a lot of demand for was, how do we take these ideas and bring them to every single employee? And of course, that's quite a bit of a higher burden, because you've got to make the ideas both simple and consumable, and obviously a lot shorter. So the full masterclass may take someone even as much as a couple of days to get through, whereas the masterclass for employees, what we call All Hands on Deck, is really designed to get through in less than an hour. And so it's a very condensed version of that. And that's now being rolled across companies, across the entire organizational base. And so all of this designed to get alignment. So we're very excited to take a look at that, since it's all available at netpromotermasterclass.com. And with that, I think I'd echo Vivek's comments and thank him very much for the invitation.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. And couple of quick housekeeping items. If you've missed part 1 and 2 of our webinar series, it's a 3-part webinar series. We had enough information that we wanted to kind of take our time and actually not overload everybody and just go through a 3-part series. So they are available on QuestionPro/webinar, as you can see. And folks who registered for the first or the second or even the third webinar, we'll send out another email with the details of with the slides as well as the recording of the webinar, so you can pass it around internally. So that's about it. Again, it was a fun time. Richard, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
It was good times. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.